Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should get started for the next session. If you could all please take your seats. We'd appreciate it very much. Well, thank you. I'm very pleased. My name is Orville Schell from the Asia Society in New York. Very pleased to welcome our three panelists, Victor Fung, Edwin Lim, and Michael Spence. You can read their biographies in your programs. And our topic is growth adjustment and convergence in Asia. And I think in many ways it's extremely appropriate that we find ourselves today here in Hong Kong, which in many ways is the epicenter of this extraordinary sort of reformatting of the world's sort of economy. Over 100 years ago, a man who at that time, before the last dynasty had fallen, Liang Qichao, had decided he would write a novel. He was an essayist of enormous notoriety, perhaps the most famous sort of public intellectual of China at the time. And he wrote a novel, he only finished 5 chapters of it. And he called it New China, A History of the Future. And in it, he tried to imagine, this of course was during a time of extraordinary decline, when China was what was called the Yazhou, the Bingfu, the sick man of Asia. And when no one really could imagine the resurgence of China, of Asia, and he wrote this novel, which was in essence a dream. And he dreamed of a time, 60 years hence, and 60 years is the cycle of the Chinese calendar, when all of the great merchants, intellectuals, leaders of the world would flock to Shanghai, much as they finally did during the World Exposition several years ago then. And at that time, he, of course, could only dream this, and he wrote, "I do not know what kind of writing this is," referring to his novel. "I cannot help but laugh at myself." And indeed, of course, the idea of China as a great power was preposterous at the time. And I think it's a measure of how much things have changed that that dream has come to pass in significant measure. And in the process of coming to pass, of course, China's rise, and indeed the rise of many other Asian countries, has really thrown the whole mosaic of world leadership into a totally different configuration. And that's really what our panel is here today to consider. What is it like? What are the new verities of these new arrangements? How is it going to affect established powers? And perhaps most importantly of all, how are countries like China going to adjust to their new status? So to start off, we're going to ask Victor Fung to kind of give us a slightly larger picture, and then Edwin and Michael will follow up. And I think we're going to focus mainly on China. Then we'll have some discussion and throw it open to questions from you all for a slightly larger perspective. So Victor.
Okay, thank you very much, Orville. I'm not so sure I'm going to give a larger picture, but I think, in fact, I would like to really help set the stage a little bit for my learned friends to really explore these very important topics, especially the challenges for the future. And I'd like to bring all of you back to the year 2008, 2009, and 2010. As in my mind, from a micro businessman's perspective, the world undertook a fundamental change during that period. And I think as a result, the way we do business, the way we look at the world, the way the global supply chains are actually working has been fundamentally changed. And let me tell you how kind of I conceptualize that, and then I'll pass to my... we all know about the Lehman crisis in 2008. In the year 2009, global trade, for the first time in living memory, dropped 12%. A lot of it is because of falling demand, external demand, but a lot of it also is because we had some short-term problems with the continuity in trade finance. Suffice it to say, it was a horrific period. And then in the year 2010, in China, a number of very interesting phenomena happened. Some of you may remember some of the very unfortunate events at a number of companies, including a company called Foxconn, in which a number of workers actually had suicides and so on, which really led people, especially the policymakers in Beijing, to really rethink the whole growth model that has driven China for 30 years since 1979, Deng Xiaoping's economic opening. Basically, in my mind, that whole model was an export-led drive, and because of lack of infrastructure in the early days, everything was actually concentrated on the coastal regions. Started with the Pearl River Delta next to Hong Kong, when we, in Hong Kong at that time, was really engaged in really developing the early stages of the supply chain, and then moved up the coast, Yangtze River Delta, etc. The infrastructure was basically on the coast. And what drove the whole Chinese model, in my mind, was a very, very interesting model of migrant workers, over 200 million, actually moving from the interior of China to the coast. And in fact, helping with the export-led growth that led to the development of China. Now, what happened in 2008 after the Lehman crisis and the catastrophic collapse of external demand, and also realizing some of the issues that it really surrounds the massive use of migrant workers. The whole model really was re-examined. You know, is this model really what China wanted to drive the country? And in my mind, then two things happened. The 12th five-year plan then came out, and basically, as we all know, the whole issue was then about rebalancing. The whole idea of shifting away from relatively low value-added export-led growth to really focusing a lot more on domestic consumption. So from a businessman's perspective, the world was actually relatively simple in the pre-2009-2010 era. You know, the global markets obviously were still very much, and is still very much today, in the OECD countries. In my mind, you know, 70–80% of global demand for a long time will be in the OECD countries. So pre-2008-2009, it was actually sourcing from the developing countries, especially in the East, and selling in the West. So everything actually was sourcing from the East, selling in the West, a sort of one-way movement. And if you remember, all the containers came back empty, right? And that was a rather simple world. But post-2008-2009, the supply chains became a lot more nuanced. You know, where is the growth of consumption in the world? And a lot of it then is going to be appearing in the countries that used to be the supply markets. Basically in the Chinas, in the Indias of this world. And basically the supply chains are no longer running one way. It's a lot more nuanced. We may still produce very much in the East, produce in China. A lot of it will be re-exported to the West, but a lot of it will be distributed. In fact, we're seeing now a growth of things that are basically manufactured in the West being sold in China and in India, primarily because, you know, made in Italy has a real cachet and can command a premium in the Chinese market. So the global supply chains have really completely shifted. And what we're really seeing then is a whole new paradigm developing. And the whole Chinese economy now is going into a period in which there's a lot more focus on domestic demand, perhaps less emphasis on the export side. China is no longer the factory to the world, right? It's now focusing on the consumption inside China. One of the most important phenomena that we'll be seeing in the next period will be, in fact, the middle class in Asia, especially in China and India, and the growth of the middle class. You know, studies have shown that the middle class in the next 10 years could grow to as much as over 500 million in China alone. So it's really now a market that the whole world has to focus on. And really the whole model has changed to thinking about how do we actually, in a sense, trade up and create more value added in the East and in some of the developing economies. And a lot of what is actually developing in the West is there's a lot of talk about reshoring of manufacturing, where there's a lot of manufacturing moving back towards the US and Europe for all the reasons that you know, of actually the cachet of made in the West, but also the idea of availability of cheaper energy that we're seeing in the shale oil phenomenon. And also because of developments, I'd like to just mention this one point, developments in the Western market in which the consumers are actually demanding more and more customized products. So what we're really seeing is a move towards mass customization in which there are larger and larger number of smaller and smaller niche markets. And to service those properly, you actually have much smaller minimum order quantities, and also you need to have much faster turnaround times. And that actually helps the phenomenon of actually manufacturing onshore, if you would, instead of contracting overseas. The final point I would make is within Asia itself, we're seeing another interesting phenomenon. With the cost of production in China now rising, and China no longer being the factory for the world, production is actually going elsewhere. The whole phenomenon that we have in the business world, looking at China plus one. You know, it's not just China, it's China plus somewhere else. Where is the one? You know, people have gone to Vietnam, gone to Cambodia, Bangladesh, and so on. So there is actually a phenomenon of actually thinking about devolving some of the manufacturing base from the traditional base in China into other parts of Asia. The final point I would make is, some people would say, yeah, that's happening, but what about the interior of China? Maybe the alternative to China is China itself, meaning moving more into an interior where the availability of land and labor is going to be a more widely available. So if I step back and really look at the macro situation, and that really relates, that will segue into this whole idea of convergence and the new growth models, is I think the model that has driven Chinese economy for the last 30 years, in my mind, symbolically ended with the Lehman crisis. Post-Lehman crisis, because of the collapse of global demand, that became very apparent that you cannot depend on just external demand and exporting all the time. And also this idea of over-reliance, if you would, on a migrant workforce and the so-called Foxconn effect that people talk about in the business world. There is a need for a new growth model. There is a need for a new paradigm, and we're now shifting towards that new paradigm. How are we going to be shifting? What must we do to actually do that shift? And what is the new model? You know, where, as I said, the supply chains that have driven the old model is no longer the simple source in the East and sell in the West, but a lot more nuanced, you know, global supply chains. So I think that really perhaps sets the scene for the need to kind of think about what is that new paradigm and how do we get there? And let me pass it back to you, Orville. And
well, Edwin, you were
my learned friends.
You've recently been in Beijing. If we're in this moment of paradigm shift, how do you think the Chinese government is doing?
Mike's going to speak first, I think.
That's right. You're number 3. Let's go to. Well, let's hold that question. Mike, will let you pick up where Victor left off. My apologies, Edwin.
No, okay. Thank you, Orville, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I thought what I would do is I've worked as Edwin's sidekick and trying to be helpful as an outsider on reforms in China, is to say a little bit about the structural reforms and basically what it means to invent or modify the growth pattern. And then Edwin can pick it up and probably talk about some of the system reforms that go with it. It's pretty clear. I mean, everybody knows about the extraordinary performance in China in the last 30 years. And the future, I think, looks very bright. You know, we're going to create, the McKinsey estimates are a middle class going from 230 million to 630 million in a 10-year period. The other really impressive thing about China has been, and the developing world as a whole, has been the resilience in the period following the crisis. The debt to GDP ratios are trending down toward 40%. The bounce back from a pretty big hit on both the credit and the trade side was extraordinary. But China has a dream, actually, that's now within sight. It's to become an advanced, creative, innovative, equitable, and sustainable economy and society, and this is important, and to return China to its pre-industrial revolution standing as a leading civilization. And I think anybody who's been close to it think this is possible, but it's not inevitable. There's a lot of surmountable challenges to deal with on the way through. I think the core of what is going to happen now has to do with consciously changing the role of the state. In a developing country, including China, in the early stages when market institutions are underdeveloped, along with a whole lot of other things, the state plays an intrusive, important, dominant role. It's basically acting as a substitute for things that are subsequently taken over by markets. And China is at the point where those deficiencies in market institutions are rapidly diminishing. And the government's role in the crudest possible terms, viewed through a market lens, is going to be to make a transition, as have its predecessors, from a rather ubiquitous participant to an upstream investor, a rule maker, and an impartial referee. Viewed from a social point of view, the government's going to get larger. The social security system's the thing that's to protect people in an increasingly volatile world are actually going to expand rather than pull back. We sometimes describe this as more market and more socialism on the way through. China's in what has come to be called the middle-income transition. It's the period of growth when you go from roughly $4,000 to $10,000 or $12,000 of per capita income, in which point you're within sight of becoming an advanced economy, at least in terms of income. Statistically speaking, the vast majority of countries that enter this transition slow down or stop. And there are only 5 exceptions, all of them here in Asia, of high-speed transitions. One of the reasons that economies stop, Victor has already adverted to, if you have an extraordinarily successful growth model, there's a very powerful tendency, supported by vested interests and other things, to stick with it and try to make it work for beyond its useful life. Now, I don't think that's going to happen in China, because my sense is that the leadership knows and talks urgently about the need for change. But it's going to be hard, okay? So Korea, the Taiwanese economy, Hong Kong and Singapore, and Japan did this at an earlier stage. No one has tried it at China's scale and complexity. No one has tried it in a global economy that's in this much trouble. And certainly all of them did it at a time when the advanced economies were much larger in relative terms and growing. That meant the tradable side of the economy, and these economies are much smaller than China. And so the most important thing I think I want to say to you today is, for China, the demand side of this transition is really important. In all of these other cases, if you were a little slow in building domestic aggregate demand and consumption and household income, you could make up the difference with this big buffer, you know, a growing, you know, healthy global economy with virtually infinite demand out there, and then it would kind of rebalance over time. China's big enough on the tradable side of the global economy that there isn't any flex there. And so they have to get this transition on the demand side right. And the starting point's not easy. Household disposable income in China is somewhere between 50 and 60%, as best we can tell. The savings rate's pretty high, and most people's estimate of consumption right now is that it's somewhere in the 40% or below range. So there's very big changes in where income lands, how it's deployed, and so on. The simple statement of it, and this is not news in China, is that the corporate sector, including the state-owned enterprises, but the corporate sector in aggregate and the government control too much of the income. And left on its own, there's a growing tendency to make low return investments, low private and social return investments, and they know that the system reforms are going to have to reverse that pattern as well as shift the income over to the domestic side. The final thing that makes this challenging from a Chinese point of view is no country at this income level entering the middle income transition was systemically important in the global economy or the global financial system, because nobody has ever done it with 1.3 billion people. And so this delicate balancing act in China between the sort of their external effects, stability and so on, and the internal agenda has not been a complexity that anybody else had to handle before. On the supply side of the economy, there's very large structural change of the type Victor described, and an economy that increasingly generates endogenously innovation. There are many components that I think most of you already know in innovative ecosystems and innovative economies. The government has an important role as an investor in the knowledge and technology base of the economy and in human capital. But on the private sector side, the one critical ingredient is competition in the dynamic sense, which means entry and exit. If you don't have there aren't any counterexamples to this. If you don't have competition for the incumbents, they don't have an incentive to innovate. Now, this principle in China is well understood. The trick is going to be, and I think Rob urges to be honest, the resistance to this is going to come from the state-owned enterprise sector in China, as it would for anybody else who's got a commanding and somewhat protected position. So there's going to be a political pushing and shoving on this front in order to get this done. Final comment, there is a great deal of anger and unrest in China. Some of it is associated with inequality. Some of it is associated with inappropriate behavior at the local level. But recently, a fair amount of it has to do with very high-level corruption and the notion that market access is tied to connections, powerful connections. What I want to say about this, and I said it in Beijing a week ago, is every country has corruption because governments have an enormous amount of power, right? They control market access, they buy a lot of things, and so on. That's not the problem. The problem is when it gets out of hand. That is, it gets to be ubiquitous. Because what happens at that point is that in order to participate in the economy, you have to participate in that aspect of it. And at that point, you get to a situation in which you can't tell the perpetrators from the victims because and you're in a new equilibrium. And you never want to get to that point because once you get there, it's very hard to get it back. I believe that's well understood, and it's probably not surprising to you that a very important, highly public set of initiatives on the Chinese side as the new leadership came into office very recently is at least initial salvo in that dimension. Bottom line is, there are a lot of skeptics about China. Some of them are skeptics because they think the political system won't support all this, or they just don't like it. I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist based on something that I think we're going to have to learn to do better in the West, and that is navigate with imperfect charts, an imperfect compass, be adaptable and learn as we go along, act and then learn. And I think the track record of attracting on a meritocratic basis extraordinarily talented people into government and policy-making positions, and then carrying out this process of understanding it as a process and carrying it out in a highly intelligent way. It means their navigation skills are pretty high. And so if you're an investor and you were a skeptic, a contrarian on China, and placed that bet every year for the last 30 years, you would have lost money. It's probably not the best bet to place now. Thank you.
So Edwin, to you, we have new leaders. We have a new chapter that really does need to be written in this epic of reform. How do you think they're doing in Beijing, and what do you think their intentions are for the future?
Well, yeah, to begin with so many people in the room that live in China, work in China, work with China, I really feel embarrassed to be asked that questions. But there's a Chinese phrase, 旁观者清, so the outsider always have a better view. So let me see whether I have a better view. There are two very concrete indicators that give me optimism about what happened to China now that there's been a changing of the guard. 4 months now, I guess. The first, I think, is very important, is the price of Mao-Tai has crashed. Now, those who laugh obviously know China. Those did not get the point obviously do not know China. But as Mike said, the first initiative is to deal with corruptions. And that's why the price of Mao-Tai has crashed, because that's the perception of the population of China that corruption will be reduced. Now, Victor said earlier, China is interconnected, interdependent with the rest of the world. So you see the price of Lafitte Rothschild has also crashed. That's even more positive news. But you know, if you want to follow as to what is the perception of Chinese about the anti-corruption effort, I think you can do a lot worse than just follow the price of Mao-Tai. The other, perhaps more far-reaching aspect of what has happened recently is a few weeks ago, the Chinese cabinet has been formed. Now, if you go back to history, and the sort of the most successful period of Chinese economic reform was obviously in the 80s, when in fact reform was orchestrated and planned from a unit called the System Reform Units, headed by the Premier himself. And when you look at the appointment a few weeks ago, you see the Vice Premier, the Governor of Central Bank, the Finance Minister, and the Governor of a very major provinces all came from this System Reform Commissions. That to me is a very good indication of a determination to go ahead with reform. As you all know, governance to a large extent is the right people and the right place. When you see this, the lineup of the economic cabinet, it really is a reason to be optimistic. But looking forward, now this is only the beginning, and it's only been a few months. But looking forward, I think we should anticipate that there will be a process, and by November of this year, during the third plenum of the Chinese 18th Party Congress, the leadership will be issuing a 10-year program for economic reform. And in fact, I think it's likely to be more than economic reform, economic, social, and political reform. Now, that will be the concrete basis on which we can evaluate the intention, not necessarily the achievement, but at least the intention of the new leadership. It would not be a short-term program. It would be a long-term program, basically laying out for the entire sort of decade of this current leadership. And that would be the critical aspect. And of course, at the moment now, we know that the leaderships are inviting inputs from all segments of Chinese society, especially the economists. And virtually, I think every Chinese economist now are writing some suggestions for this reform program. I think it's a very, very interesting time, and we will have to see, and it will be launched at the third plenum, which should be sometime in October, November. But what can we anticipate? In fact, Mike has already mentioned this. China is a socialist market economy. And the question that many people are asking, will it be more socialist or will it be more market? The answer is emphatically yes. And it is serious when you look at it, and it's a reflection of both the intention of the leadership as well as the problems of the last decade. China needs to be more socialist, and China needs to further develop its market economy. As Mike has said, I think all our work in China has given us this impression that it really has to strengthen its socialist principle, and at the same time, it is still a long way to go in building a really efficient and innovative market economy. Now, let me just anticipate what may be coming up on both fronts. I think on the socialist front, we hear a lot about the increase in income disparity in China that has emerged since the beginning of the reform program. And the Gini coefficient in China today is, I think in fact you even have a session later on just to talk about inequality in China. Well, I don't want to rain on your parade, but I don't think inequality is very important. I think that's what is now important in China is not this disparity of income, but the disparity in opportunity. I think there's a lot more conscious acceptance that in the market economy, you're going to have differences in outcome. But I think what people are very unhappy about now is the disparity, inequality in opportunity, or what Chinese call distributional unfairness. 分配不公，收入分配不公. That's really the greatest unhappiness. And that's something that the government has to deal with. There's a range of issues. Corruption is obviously right on top of that. The rent seeking, the abuse of government positions. But also you get down to the inequality of basic educations among different regions. That simply, China has achieved a great deal in terms of basic education. But the quality of basic education in the poorer provinces are horrible compared to the quality in Shanghai and Beijing and so on. The health systems, Social Security, they're now only moving towards universal coverage. A few years ago, only 1/3 of the population, working population, was covered by the basic pension system. So that's going to be one area I think we will see movement. That's to strengthening socialism by strengthening social justice, by strengthening social services, and by basically increasing or sustaining intergenerational mobility, which I think is very much a concern of the Chinese people today. Now, what about the other side of the craze, market? Now, it's a long way, and I think critical here, of course, is the role of the public sector, the SOEs. If we have a bit of time, let me divert a bit, because I think it's quite important. We asked Tony Atkinson, which in fact is part of the INET in Oxford, to do a study for us on the privatization program of the Thatcher regime in England. Because after all, there is a lot of talk in China about reducing SOEs and privatizing SOEs and so on. Now, Tony did this for us, and also he was himself very much involved in that program. Very interesting how it came out. He thought from in efficiency term, it's done well. Although most of us who take train in England would not agree that there was an improvement in efficiency. But nonetheless, I think the indicator show that in efficiency term, privatization program of Thatcher has been relatively successful. But the question is, what happened to the family server? Where has the money gone? You privatized. And what happened to public capital? There was enormous amount of public capital embedded in those public enterprises. Where are they now? And if you, in England today, obviously as a consequence of the global economic crisis and all the problems and recession and so on, England is facing very fiscal problem. Now, every day you hear in the news, I live in London, by the way, so you hear it's a cut in the benefit, cut in the allowance, a cut in the thing. you know, it's a horribly austerity program, a very harsh austerity program. Now, if only someone somewhere, and this is not according to me, according to Tony Atkinson, had thought about this and maintained the public capital. You know, in the West now, or Anglo-Saxon economics, we don't think about the government public balance sheet very much, and Mike is beginning to revive thinking. You know, we're only thinking fiscal in terms of flow, and not very much in terms of balance sheet. So let me come back to China. When you look at SOEs, I think you should start with the premise that China has a huge stock of public capital. Now, I think it's a good thing. It's a feature of the socialist principle, but it's also a fun for a country like China, with still a vast amount of people, very poor, and in an uncertain world, having a large amount of public capital is an asset which Chinese should take advantage of to preserve. But the issue for China in the next 10, 20 years is how to make best use of this public capital. In other words, China has a very strong balance sheet, but how to use this balance sheet in a way which is consistent with efficiency, innovation, as well as social objective. And that's going to be the challenge of China. Yeah, how to make use of the capital and the resources that are embedded in the SOE in order that it can best serve the people and also be promoting efficient and innovative development. The one area of reform that I think we will see a lot of soon is fiscal reform, and certainly on intergovernment relationship, which is something that's been ignored. And in the '94, fiscal reform was very successful, but it essentially focused on the revenue side. But there was not much thinking about the division of the responsibility among the different levels of government. And I think that's what we will see quickly. But because it is the source of a lot of problems, I think many of you know about the expropriation of farmers' land by the local government. It's simply because the local government has inadequate resources, and land is their main source of income. You also see a lot of protectionism. Local government protecting their own SOEs or protecting the SOE as against private sector and so on. So dealing with local fiscal situations should be a priority in the coming Chinese reform program. So those are just basic elements. I mean, I think to a large extent, we're all speculating on what we read. And as I say, I think the 10-year reform program in November will be something to look forward to. Thank you very much.
Victor, you had a comment.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add one quick point to what my colleagues have said, I think in this, if we step back again and look at this whole sort of rebalancing in China, away from the export sector and more towards the consumption and domestic consumption and so on, I think one of the key things we need to focus on is the whole issue of jobs and employment. You know, obviously, from a macro standpoint, this is absolutely the right thing to do. However, let me just remind everybody, there are over 200 million people employed in the so low value added, yes, perhaps highly polluting, so export sector. What are you going to do with all the people? And in my mind, the success of that whole rebalancing, the development of the new growth models and the speed with which this could happen critically depends on how you can redeploy the people. And I think the answer really lies in the development of the services sector. China's service sector, by any standard, is actually relatively small. It's 43% of the GDP. And any developing countries is easily over 60%. And indeed, in the current 12 five-year plan, the goal is to move it from 43% to 47%, a 4% change. So, how are we going to find jobs actually and develop the services sector in order to actually absorb these people so that the whole country can rebalance? And I think the answer really, I thought some about this, really is two. One is this issue of continued urbanization. The national policy that has been going on for the last 5 years is continuing in this current five-year plan of moving 1% of the population from the rural into the urban areas. I think that would actually provide a lot of impetus. The second, I think, is in the wholesale upgrading of the internal distribution system. the internal supply chains. We talk about the inefficiencies in the global supply chains. We talk about the soft $3, meaning if the stuff leaves the factory costing $1, by the time it gets to the consumer overseas, it's costing $4. So there are $3 in the supply chain, soft $3. In China, studies have shown that that is actually $4 on domestic distribution. So there's a huge amount of efficiencies and restructuring of the domestic distribution economy, which also is synonymous with the development of the service sector, and also synonymous with the ability to absorb the people and the creation of jobs. And I think that, to me, is a key swing factor in the speed and also the viability of the whole strategy. And Mike, as you point out, because China is sort of maxed out on the domestic, in the international side, there's probably not much room for error in actually making the shift.
Let me ask you all to respond very quickly to a question before we open it up. China's had 2.5 decades, pretty impressive run with no major downturns. Do you think they are pioneering or close to pioneering a new model of the right mix of control and freedom? How do you all explain this rather unusual period of steady growth?
Well, to be fair, I mean, I don't want to rain on the parade, but part of that is the way the statistics are reported. I don't think anybody doubts there's been some smoothing of the data. And at least the more accurate data I've seen shows more ups and downs than you would expect. The second thing I think is what Edwin was talking about. This, but for historical reasons, is a country that entered with a huge and growing state balance sheet, which they have deployed on behalf of the population very effectively. They have very high levels of public sector investment, and when there's a lull or a shock, they've accelerated it and, you know, carried the economy over when it could have been badly demand constrained. So at least I think on my side, being brief, part of the answer is effective kind of pragmatic economic management with a starting point where you had the resources to get it done.
A great paradox, isn't it, in a nation where we assume that Leninism was a rigid system incapable of responding to shocks and challenges. Any other quick comments? Good. Let's open it up to you all. There are microphones, I'm sure, going around. If anyone has a question, I'd be glad to please raise your hand. Right here. Are there microphones, or do we just jump up? Well, jump up.
Thank you. I'm Chandran Nair. I live in Hong Kong. I'm going to take the invitation from the opening remarks to sort of not remain silent about some brutal facts. So I think we've heard a great deal about paradigm shifts, you know, nice terminology, new economic growth, but no specifics. And with all due respect, all I've heard is old stuff. And I think if one looks at the challenges ahead in Asia, if I put it very crudely, in 2050, there'll be about 6 billion Asians. I think the new paradigm shift, the economic model, should ask a fundamental question. Can 5-6 billion Asians aspire to live like Americans or Europeans? If you live in this part of the world, most of us honestly know this is simply not possible. Ask the scientists, don't ask the economists, but we all know that this is simply not possible. So I think the discussion, if there's to be new economic thinking, is to be, and this is very politically unpalatable, how will Asians live? What will they have? Not because they are a unique species, but just because there are too many. And therefore, what are their rights? What's the price of consumption? And let me finish by just using cars as a proxy of what is commonly seen as a right to growth and consumption. Anyone who lives in Asia or been in an Asian city will know that we need more cars in Asian cities, like I need a hole in my head. And this is not about pollution. This is essentially the price of mobility that is taken as a human right. So I'll argue finally and say that car ownership will not be a human right. I know this is not palatable in the USA, but this is something we will need to adjust to. And therefore, I would argue we will need stronger institutions. Again, we will need strong states. And the narrative needs to change about what we can and can't have, and therefore what are pricing models. If Asia is to have another billion consumers, like the guys at McKinsey like to overstate, I mean, we have about 650 million consumers today. 650 million Asian consumers have rocked the world. It's frightened Americans, frightened Europeans, etc. And of course, they've all blamed the Chinese for, doing nasty things. But if there's to be another billion Asian consumers, please beware. Things will never be, can't be the same. And we cannot go around talking about stuff in very abstract terms. There will have to be limits and constraints. And I'll finish by saying, in the opening remarks again, and I've been to many of these conferences, everyone makes some sort of a passing statement about resource constraints. When we get into the details, everyone stops talking about it. It's business as usual. My friends, there will be resource constraints. It's called physics. It's called thermodynamics and entropy. Everyone can't have everything. And this part of the world will be the laboratory for that. And I dare say that the new ideas will not come from the West, because it's tied to the old ideas. And those ideas need to come out of here. But the Asians are subservient.
Let's get a response since time is really short. Gents,
thank you very much.
How do you respond to this challenge to new economic thinking? Is this consumer model that China is pioneering square with it in any way?
No, I think the great opportunity in the developing world, and including here in Asia, where 60% of the world's population resides, is that all this infrastructure hasn't been built. So how cities get built, how transportation is handled, how energy efficient dwellings are, is one of the great opportunities to start to move the growth model in the direction of lighter impact on natural resources and the environment. And you're starting to see serious attention to it. A very important part of the 12th five-year plan, as was true a little bit in the 11th five-year plan, is pretty aggressive, we would admit insufficient, but aggressive assault on this. So I believe it's in focus. Now, whether we're going to get it done, on a global basis, I think one is right to be skeptical, but it's not as if they're not thinking about it.
Let me just respond very quickly. Chandra is, of course, right. I think the answer is very simple. You cannot just keep on doing what you're doing and ask what is the consequence to this environment and to the world and so on. What I think you really need to do is to jump to the end and ask yourself how much resources are really available. And maybe that resource set could be somewhat expanded by technology. I don't think technology will solve the whole problem. And then, frankly, move backwards to ask what are the feasible trajectories that one could pursue. It comes down to Asians, and I think eventually the whole world's choice of lifestyles. And I think you've just got to think about choosing the lifestyles that are available to you instead of saying, that's the lifestyle I want, I don't care whatever anybody else does, etc. But let me add fuel to the fire. I think you talk about adding 1 billion consumers. Yes, that's a lot of people demanding goods and so on. But I'm also concerned about adding 1 billion workers to the workforce. How are you going to find work for those people? And if you believe all like the World Bank reports and things that are available, this additional 1 billion workforce is basically unskilled. So if you're thinking about adding 1 billion unskilled labor to the global workforce, I really don't know what the answer is. It's got to be, first of all, I think a total rethinking of the growth model, how you actually can usefully deploy people. Maybe the concept of how long you work, the balance between leisure and work has to be changed. And frankly, the last thing I would say is you need a very strong revolution in education and actually getting these people into the right set of skills very, very quickly in order for them to be able to adapt. So I think that's my answer. It's actually perhaps even more pessimistic than yours.
Now, alas, I see the time has really run out. I know this is a very truncated question and answer period, but let me just end up by asking each of you with utmost brevity, what piece of advice would each of you proffer to the new leaders as they begin this next 10-year voyage of reform in China? And Michael, let's start with you.
I think it would be, you can't do everything at once, so it would be to focus on the things that are the deepest sources of social concern. The delivering on the sort of competitive meritocratic basis that's been a tradition in China for a long time, on the things that Edwin talked about, the perceived lack of equality of opportunity and so on. I think that's the foundation on which you can get on with this more sort of technocratic stuff. It's not that that stuff's unimportant, it's just you may not make it there. And I guess the last thing would be, you know, this is a system that's politically evolving fairly rapidly. I don't think that's the outside perception, but it's a system that in the middle income transition, most economies that have dominant single parties or are autocratic become multi-party democracies. Now, I wouldn't want to turn that into a prediction about China, but when you have the internet and the social media and whatnot, you just can't ignore the fact that at this stage, people are going to want a voice in collective choice. And so my advice would be pay attention to that and adapt. Edwin, very briefly.
Yeah, there's some very strong feeling among the population today, great social tension, as you know, unhappiness. And I would suggest the leadership has to deal with that through some, as Mike said, you know, simple measures that would show some immediate result, and shows the leadership determination to tackle some of these issues. That's been the feature of Chinese reform for the past 30-odd years. It's, you know, small steps, but with very visible result. And
Victor, last word.
Well, very quickly, I certainly agree with what Mike has said and what Edwin has said. I think the centrality of the need to tackle the corruption issue, and that in many ways, I think, is synonymous with thinking about the future role of the SOEs. And the thing that you're really trying to get to, I think, is to not so much thinking about the change of ownership. I think the ownership issue can be debated, you know, whether the SOEs really need to be privatized or not. But I think they have to be operating in such a way as not to inhibit competition in the market. Competition for the private enterprises domestically, and frankly, I think China would do well with opening up more to overseas competition to really, so it's really how the restructuring of the state-owned enterprise sectors could be done in such a way as to satisfy the national needs, and I know there are a number, and then also to actually not stifle competition in the process. And that, I think, is the next step in the challenge.
Well, join me in thanking our three panelists for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Victor.
thank you.
Very good.